All right, well, let's get started. Hey, everyone. Thank you for joining and welcome to Paragon's first ever live webinar. I'm Brandon Fu and I'm the founder and CEO of Paragon. And today we'll be showing you how to build a native CRM in Paragon in just under 20 minutes. All right, got a couple people joining us here, which is great. We'll go ahead and get started. So to quickly go over our agenda, we'll start with a quick introduction and some background on Paragon. From there, we will walk you through how Paragon handles managed integration authentication for any CRM. Then we'll go into building a bi-directional sync use case and show you how to create that native integration for Salesforce and HubSpot on Paragon. And lastly, we'll have some time for questions and answers from the audience. All right, let's get started. So to start with some background on why we started Paragon and what problem we aim to solve. So first of all, as you all know, the SaaS ecosystem has grown exponentially in the last few years. And today, the average company uses hundreds of different SaaS applications. So that means that for any software company, any B2B software company selling into the markets today, it's essentially become a requirement that your customers can easily integrate your products with the hundreds of other tools and applications that they use. And not only has this become essentially requirements for customers in the market today, research has shown that integrations actually have a direct revenue impact, meaning that SaaS companies that have more integrations exhibit higher retention and higher willingness to pay because they're able to provide more value to customers. And as customers connect your product and integrate it with other tools that they use, it becomes stickier and they're more likely to retain. So the problem has been that until now, building integrations and CRM integrations has been still extremely costly and inefficient. We've seen that it can take anywhere from 3 to 6 months of dedicated engineering per integration if you're building these integrations in-house. And the reason why is because every API is different. So it essentially requires that your engineers become domain experts in each individual vendor API. And not only is that extremely costly and time-consuming for your engineering team to develop these integrations, it also can become even more expensive to scale and maintain these integrations as these APIs can be constantly changing. And your engineers are essentially responsible for the ongoing maintenance, making sure that your integrations are up to date indefinitely over the entire lifespan of those integrations. So that's why we built Paragon, and that's how we're going to show you, or why we're going to show you how Paragon can help you develop and maintain these CRM integrations much easier and much faster. As a quick high-level introduction to Paragon, Paragon is a unified scalable solution for SaaS integrations. And what we do is provide a single connecting platform, a single SDK that you can install in your app with a few lines of code, and then use our built-in API connectors with integrations like HubSpot and Salesforce to build these integrations natively into your application and provide them for your end users, for your customers. So today we're going to show you a basic example of how to create a bi-directional sync CRM integration for Salesforce and HubSpot using Paragon. And without further ado, let's dive in. So what I have here is a sample application that I set up with the Paragon SDK installed. And this is just a basic web application. And you could think of this as a stand-in for your own SaaS application. Right. And by installing the Paragon SDK, you're able to embed native integrations into your web application and provide them for your customers, for your end users to connect, authenticate, and consume those integrations from within, natively from within your application. So you can see, for example, here I have a couple integrations with Salesforce and HubSpot already set up. This is provided by the Paragon SDK. And let's say I'm an end user of this application. I can click on Salesforce here, and that displays the Paragon Connect portal. So this is part of the Paragon SDK and the pre-built UI that's provided by our SDK that can be embedded in your application and displayed for your end users to connect the Salesforce integration and authenticate and activate the integration all natively from within your app. So to show you how that works, I'll click connect here. Let's say I'm an end user. I want to activate the Salesforce integration. So I'll click connect. This will take me through the Salesforce OAuth flow. I've already logged into my Salesforce account in this case, so I just have to click allow. And that will successfully connect and authenticate my Salesforce account. And now I have activated this integration. So what's happening under the covers here is that the Paragon SDK provides fully managed authentication, which means that Paragon securely stores and manages the end user's Salesforce, HubSpot, and other app credentials so that your team doesn't have to build the authentication individually with each of these providers. Right? Essentially, you can just install the Paragon SDK once and then essentially instantly connect to your users' Salesforce or HubSpot or any other applications from within your app. So now that I've connected my Salesforce accounts, I've activated the integration, you can see that there's a few workflows here. And this is essentially how we define the integration logic or the features that are provided for end users that you can see here in the Connect portal. So to show you how that works, I'm going to switch over to the Paragon dashboard. And you can see here our integration catalog. And today we support over 100 pre-built integrations with some of the most popular SaaS providers. But today we're going to start by focusing on our Salesforce integration. So here in the Paragon dashboard, this is where your engineering or product team would build the workflows or essentially define the integration logic for your users. And we'll show you how to set up a couple workflows here to create a basic bi-directional sync use case for our Salesforce and HubSpot integrations. So let's say that for a bi-directional sync use case, I want to sync contacts between my sample app and my users' Salesforce and HubSpot accounts. So let's say whenever a contact is created in my app, I want to sync that to my user's Salesforce or HubSpot CRMs, and vice versa. Whenever a contact is created in my user's Salesforce or HubSpot, I want to sync those back to my sample app, right? So we have a couple workflows here set up that define the workflows for our bi-directional sync use case. And I'll start by showing you how to create the workflow that will push contacts from my sample app to my user's Salesforce CRM. And in Paragon, workflows essentially provide building blocks for different actions and logic that allow you to easily define how should data map between your application and your user's Salesforce or your HubSpot or other app integrations. So to walk through how to kind of create the workflow for this use case, our workflow here is triggered by a contact created app event. And app events in Paragon are how you can send data from your application to trigger this workflow in Paragon. I've created a contact created event here, which means that whenever a contact is created in my app, I can send that data to the Paragon SDK with that contact data, and it'll trigger this workflow. So this is just an example. You can create an app event and send any data that you want. And the great thing about app events too is that you only need to define them once in your application, and the same events can then be used to trigger different workflows or different integrations. So you can see here, this contact created events with some of the sample contact data. So this will trigger the workflow whenever a contact is created in my sample application. Next, I'm going to add a Salesforce step to my workflow. And here in Paragon, we provide built-in actions on top of the Salesforce and HubSpot APIs, for example, that allow you to easily perform actions to those providers, or essentially a visual abstraction on top of those APIs. So in this case, I'm actually going to build some upsert logic for our sync, and we'll start by searching if this contact already exists in Salesforce, because if it already exists, we actually just want to update it rather than creating that contact. So we'll call this step search for contacts. And here we can say we want to search for the contact by the email address. So we'll use the email as the identifier. So we can say that we want to search for the contacts where the email exactly matches the email from the initial app events that I use to trigger this workflow. So I can test this step, and looks like might need to reconnect our integration here. So let's just try that real quick. Great. So we have this contact data that was returned from the Salesforce API. So we're able to successfully search for that contact in Salesforce. And next, we're going to add a conditional step to our workflow. So this is one of the utility steps, essentially, that's provided by the Paragon workflow editor that allows you to create more custom or complex integration logic. So what we're going to do here is we're going to use this conditional to evaluate if this is a new contact or if it already exists in Salesforce. We can do that by checking the size of the array that was returned from the previous step. So we can say that if the size of the array is 0, that means it's a new contact, right? It doesn't already exist in Salesforce. So if it is a new contact, then of course we want to create that contact in Salesforce. I'm going to add another step to my workflow here. I'll call this create contact. And we'll use this Salesforce create contact step. And here we can use Paragon to map any of the properties from our initial contact created events into the fields of the contact that we're creating in Salesforce. So here, for example, I can map the first name. I can map the last name, and let's add the email as well. So these are the fields that we're going to pass into the Salesforce contact that we're creating. And again, these are fields that are provided from that initial contact created event that we sent in the app event to trigger this workflow. So next, we want to handle the case in which the contact already exists. So we're going to do something similar here. I'll duplicate this step and move it over to the no branch of my workflow. And here, we'll just change this to update the contacts. We're going to update the contact instead of creating a new one. So similarly, I can pass in the fields from my contact created events into the fields that I want to update on this contact. And the only thing that we'll add here is a reference to the ID of the Salesforce record that we got from the Salesforce search contact step. So that'll update this contact if it already exists in Salesforce with any of these fields that I choose to pass in. And that's pretty much all we have to do to set up this first half of our bidirectional sync use case for Salesforce integration. And the last thing I'll do here is I'll deploy the workflow. And what this does is it'll push the workflow live to all of my end users. And if we switch back to the sample app and we pull up the Connect portal, you can see that any workflows that I've deployed become available for my end users in the Connect portal, and they can activate those workflows in the Connect portal. So that means that essentially you just need to create or define the workflows in Paragon once to define these features or the integration logic, and they can be made available to all of your users to activate here in the Connect portal. So I want to show you the other half of our bidirectional sync use case, and we have another workflow here that's going to pull in new records from Salesforce and sync them to our sample application. So the way we're going to do that here is we have what we call webhook triggers in Paragon. And so this is going to automatically trigger whenever a new record is created in my user's Salesforce account that they've connected. So whenever a new contact is created in Salesforce, it's going to trigger this workflow with that contact data. We can see an example of that Salesforce contact data here. And then from there, we're just going to add one more step. This is going to be an HTTP request step. And we'll use this to send that contact data from Salesforce to our API. So what we can do here is create an API endpoint or a webhook listener that can be used to ingest that contact data from Salesforce into our application. And we'll call this sends contact to our API. We don't have an actual API setup in this case, so we'll just mock out what this would look like, for example. So let's say this is a /contacts endpoints on our API. And what we can do in the body of this request is define the schema that our API expects. So let's say our contacts API expects an email, a first name, a last name. And then in the body of this request, I can then map that incoming data from the Salesforce contact that triggered this workflow. And I can choose to map any of those properties from the Salesforce contact into whatever the schema is that my API expects. So I'll map the email, first name, and last name from the Salesforce contact. And so one thing to note here is that when you create an API like this to ingest contacts from your users' CRMs, you only need to create that API once. And in Paragon, here is where you can essentially map the data from Salesforce to your API or from HubSpot to your API. So you only need to maintain a single API schema, and Paragon can then be used to map whatever the contact schema from Salesforce or the contact schema from HubSpot to whatever schema that your API expects. And that's essentially all we need to do to set up our other half of the bidirectional sync use case for our Salesforce integration. So again, this is going to pull in new contacts in real time from Salesforce, and it's going to sync it to our API, to our application. So we'll deploy this workflow as well. And that completes our bidirectional sync use case for our Salesforce CRM. And what we'll do now is we'll actually test one part of this integration. So I can enable the push new contacts workflow here in the Connect portal. That's going to activate that workflow. So I can now push contacts from my sample application to Salesforce. And to demonstrate that, we're going to send the contacts created app events. Here we'll just send it in the browser console to demonstrate. But we'll use the Paragon SDK here, the Paragon.event method, to send that contact created event from our sample application. And by sending that event, that should trigger our workflow and create that contact in Salesforce. So if we switch back over to Paragon, we'll go to our task history page. And task history is part of Paragon's monitoring and observability suite. So essentially, it provides end-to-end logging and monitoring for all of your integration activity. So any workflow execution, anytime there's integration activity on Paragon, it'll be logged and displayed here in task history. So you can see that the contact created events that we just sent to the SDK successfully triggered our push new contacts to Salesforce workflow. And I can actually click into that workflow here in task history, and I can see the detailed logs for this workflow. So here we were able to successfully trigger our workflow with that contact event that we just sent. It did already exist in Salesforce, so it took the no path and then updated the contact in Salesforce, which we can see here. Great. So now that we've shown our Salesforce bidirectional sync use case, I want to quickly show you how we can easily replicate essentially the same integration for another CRM provider for our HubSpot integration. So if we go over to our HubSpot integration, you can see that building new integrations, scaling to new integrations in Paragon can be as easy as just creating a few additional workflows. And here we have essentially the same workflows that we set up for our Salesforce integration. To save us time, I've already built these beforehand, but you can see that essentially these HubSpot workflows follow the exact same pattern that's our Salesforce workflows we just set up. And here as well, you can see that our HubSpot workflow is triggered by the same contact created app event, which means that I only need to emit those events, send those events from my application once, and they can be used to trigger any number of workflows or any number of integrations on Paragon. So it's much easier for us to add new integrations essentially without having to change the SDK logic. So this is our HubSpot integration or workflow that pushes contacts from our app to HubSpot. Again, similar to our Salesforce workflow. And we also have our HubSpot workflow that's going to pull these new contacts in from HubSpot and sync them to our application by sending them to our API. So lastly, just to show you a quick demonstration for a HubSpot workflow as well, I can click on HubSpot here. That's going to pull up the Connect portal for HubSpot. So again, with our Salesforce integration, we can display this Connect portal in our application for our end users to connect their HubSpot accounts, provide that authentication, and allow them to activate the HubSpot integration all from within our app, natively from within our app experience. And you can see the workflows here that we've created as well. And I'm going to enable this push new contacts workflow in the Connect portal. So now if I send my same contacts created app event here in the console, so I'll send this contacts created event again to the Paragon SDK, switch back to Paragon and go to our task history. We can see that that same contact event now successfully created the contact both in Salesforce and HubSpot because I have both of those integrations now connected and enabled. So we were able to successfully trigger both our Salesforce and HubSpot workflows and sync that contact to both of our CRMs. Great. So that about wraps up our demo. And hopefully this helps demonstrate, at least at a high level, how you can really easily create integrations with CRMs like Salesforce and HubSpot here in just under 20 minutes using Paragon. Of course, this really only just scratches the surface of what's really possible, the types of integrations, the types of workflows or features that you can build on Paragon. So hopefully this was helpful, at least as a quick introduction, but hopefully we can also have more webinars in the future to show you more examples of what you can do, what types of integrations that you can build with Paragon. All right. So thank you guys. And next, we'll be opening up to some questions and Q&A from the audience. All right. So we have a question. What if there is a CRM that we need? Someone asked, what if there's a CRM we need to build that you don't support? That's a great question. So as I showed earlier, our catalog today is over 100 integrations with some of the most popular providers, SaaS providers in the market. However, excuse me, even if we don't support a pre-built integration for a provider that you want to integrate with Paragon, we can support that using Paragon's custom integration builder. So essentially, we provide a framework that allows you to use Paragon's SDK and our managed authentication to essentially create custom connectors with any provider as long as they have a public API. So custom integrations allow you to essentially extend the Paragon platform, the Paragon SDK, to create your own custom connectors with any CRM or essentially any provider, as long as that they have a public API. So we have another question. How is Paragon different from unified APIs? So that's a great question. Unified APIs, in general, essentially what they do provide a standard data model, a standard API for all of the providers in a particular category. So let's say, for example, all the CRMs, there's going to be a standard data model, a standard API for all the CRMs. And typically, unified APIs can be good if you need to very quickly integrate with many providers in the same category. But what we found is that unified APIs are typically only well suited for very simple or very basic integrations. And the reason why is that because they have this sort of standard, object model, standard data model, it does have a lot of limitations in terms of the types of data or provider-specific data, provider-specific behavior that's essentially abstracted away from that unified API and unified data model. So we found that a lot of folks who are using unified APIs can be fairly limited in terms of the depth of the types of integrations that they can build because of the limitations of that standard data model. And the difference with Paragon, as we demonstrated earlier, is that we allow you to essentially get one-to-one parity against each of the individual provider APIs. So for Salesforce, for HubSpot, any actions or any data that's available on those APIs essentially are also available through Paragon, through our workflow builder, and through our SDK. So while on Paragon, you do build integrations individually against HubSpot, Salesforce, and each provider, we do typically provide much more depth, much more flexibility, and much more customizability in terms of the types of features, the depth of integrations that you can develop, and the flexibility of the integrations that you can develop on Paragon. John asks, are there cron triggers to ask data from an API periodically? That's a great question, and there is. On Paragon, we showed you the webhook triggers, which essentially allow for a real-time sync from providers like Salesforce or HubSpot, but we do also provide a scheduler trigger that essentially allows you to run workflows on a cron, which means that you can set up, for example, a recurring sync. It's one of the common use cases that we do see on Paragon, where let's say every day or maybe even every hour or every few minutes, you want to periodically pull for new data from Salesforce or HubSpot or another provider and sync them to your application. Someone asked, do we have to use your UI? So while Paragon does provide a pre-built UI, which we showed earlier, our Connect portal that makes it easy for you to get started and provide these integrations natively in your application, it's not a requirement to use the Connect portal to use our pre-built UI. So we do also provide a headless API, essentially, that can be used to implement Paragon, our authentication, any of our features into your application. And you can build essentially any custom UI that you want on top of the Paragon API on the SDK, on top of our SDK, to provide the same functionality for your end users. Is there a free trial? Brent asks, and yes, we do have a free trial. So you can go to useparagon.com and you can sign up for a free 14-day trial. I think someone from our team can probably post the link here in the chat to make that easy for you. And we're also happy to follow up after this to set up a more detailed demo, talk about what integrations that you might be looking for on Paragon and set you up with a demo or a trial from there.